The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Charlotte Galloway. Charlotte is quite interesting because even though you have curators who sometimes work as lecturers and lecturers who sometimes work as curators, like Adrian, who's going to be speaking about that later today, Charlotte has really had her feet firmly in both camps for periods of time over her career. She worked at the National Gallery of Australia both as an Asian art Asian art curator, and then as Associate Registrar of Loans and Exhibitions, which is, for those who don't understand the workings of galleries, that's a key position in galleries, a negotiation of loans and works of art for exhibitions, and requires astonishing kind of abilities in negotiation skills. Then after that she did her PhD in Buddhist imagery of the early Bagan period in Myanmar, and she returned to ANU to lecture in curatorial studies and established and convenes the undergraduate major and minor courses in Asian art history. So she's also a member of a number of organisations. You can check on the ANU website if you're interested. So Charlotte, it's with great pleasure. I hope I've sufficiently embarrassed you. I'd like to ask you to speak. I don't dare touch this. You're right. This is fine. Yeah. Oh, we're going ahead. Okay, yeah, good. Thank you, Charlotte.
What James has left out of some of that is some more personal connections. When I was working as the Loans and Exhibitions Registrar, we managed to spend 2 weeks in Java travelling around together when we were doing the loans for the James's fabulous show on the Southeast Asian Islamic arts. And we'll keep all of those things to ourselves. All right. First of all, I'd just like to thank Stephen and Mark for organising, Stephen and Olivier for organising this symposium, which is a fabulous opportunity. We don't often get an opportunity as people working in the field to come together like this, so that's absolutely fantastic. But basically, what I'm going to be talking about today is some of my experience, and as I reflect on my role now, as James says, I've done a number of different things in the arts, in Asian art, and looking at where I am today, and as a Southeast Asian sort of art historian or specialist in that area, and just share with you some of the history of Southeast Asian art and Asian art at ANU, where I'm working, which perhaps brings us forward to the point and where we might go forward into the future. Now, this should all just roll on. I'm not talking to the slides. 3 weeks ago, I returned from Myanmar after a 12-day trip with 16 students, undergraduates and postgraduates, mostly art history majors, but also some from Asian studies, and my PhD student, Sally, who's here today, who gave me a lot of support. This was the first time I know of that art history students have travelled to Myanmar for a formal course of study. And leading up to this trip, and with the symposium in mind, I'd spent a lot of time reflecting on the sort of type of experience I expected them to have, and in university parlance, what sort of learning outcomes would be achieved. And don't worry, I'm not going to be talking about educational matters so much here. The first things that came to mind as I put together the itinerary was what a difference a few years makes. And when I first proposed this course of Asian art in country 3 years ago, I never thought I'd ever be taking students to Myanmar. Such were the political circumstances and access difficulties. But like all things in Southeast Asia, change can happen quickly, and also some things stay the same. And this living mix of tradition and history, and in the Myanmar context, it's Buddhism, which is being the constant for nearly 2 millennia, is something, a particular feature I see in Southeast Asia. And the visual culture of Myanmar, in this case, being so eclectic and rich, and traversing both abandoned archaeological sites and living historic temples, you know, old is always mixed with new, but it never replaces it. It works together. I was struggling to come up with a framework that would facilitate the students' understanding of Myanmar's art historical narrative in such a short time. And thinking of the places we'd be visiting, from ancient city sites, from the Pew that were UNESCO listed in 2014, to well-known tourist destinations such as Bagan and Mandalay, and then to finishing off back in Yangon to look at the vibrant contemporary art scene there, I realised that I wore many hats. And for most part, I undertake historical research and work with archaeologists. There are basically no art historians. I'm not, as I noted in the abstract for this paper, I'm an art historian is met with vague looks and a polite smile when I'm introduced to many colleagues in Myanmar. Southeast Asian art history, as we understand it, is a discipline that simply does not exist in Myanmar or indeed across much of Southeast Asia, where art history is more usually associated with art schools and Western notions of art or museums. It does not resonate locally with Southeast Asian studies, which usually fall into the domains of history, archaeology or anthropology. And while I have established my research credentials locally, my ANU business card certainly baffles them. You're in the School of Art? I do not try to explain, but as it stands, such disciplinary misunderstandings do little to facilitate international collaborative research in my field. This really did make me ponder then what makes Southeast Asian art history such a sort of complex entity. And while my current sort of thinking is without really any conclusion, reflecting on the history of Asian art history has helped me clarify some of my thoughts. And in the context of past, present and future at this symposium, I'll just share some of that history of Asian and Southeast Asian art history at ANU, which has really helped shape Southeast Asian art historical approaches. Asian art history has been offered in some form almost continuously at ANU since 1985, but as Melanie alluded, we actually had Asian faculty or Oriental Studies faculties from 1961 when ANU actually embarked on having faculties. It had been a research university. In sort of contrast, in a way, while Asian studies was already established, fine art or art history was only taught for the first time in 1977, and Sasha Grishin was the first lecturer. Interestingly, though, the connection between Western art history and Asia was recognised even from the earliest times. And going through the university handbooks was obviously the only way to reconstruct some of this history. Fine Art A and Fine Art B in 1977, which was run in the Faculty of the Humanities, were listed as approved courses to form a mixed major with Asian Civilization major, which was run in the Faculty of Asian Studies. By 1984, Fine Art was listed as an accepted prerequisite for a course in Chinese Aesthetics, which was run in Asian Studies. The following year, Professor Helmut Lufwisova established a course called The Art of Indianised Mainland Southeast Asia, which was taught by arrangement. Not quite sure what that means, but I suspect it means depending on how many students might be interested. This was the first specialist Asian art history course at ANU. In 1988, Michael Greenhouse was appointed the first Nobel Professor of Art History, and the department then changed its names from Fine Arts to the Department of Art History. Greenhouse was very interested in Asian architecture, and he established a course in Japanese art and architecture within this new department. In the same year, Lufwisova offered a course on the art and architecture of Southeast Asia in Asian Studies. The Japanese art course in the art history department was accepted as an outside unit for the Asian Studies students. And then when John Clark joined the art history department in 1989, courses in the art of modern Asia and painting in China and Japan were taught for the first time, and both were cross-listed as part of the Asian Studies programs. An Introduction to Asian Art course was run in 1992 and also approved for inclusion in the Chinese and Japanese Studies majors. But at the same time, Asian Studies departments stopped offering Asian art history courses. And this is really quite an important period in the sort of development of Asian art history at ANU. To this point, Asian art history had a fairly fair presence at ANU, benefiting from ANU's strong international research focus and particular focus on Asia, and a forward-looking approach in interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary studies. The Humanities Research Centre had been established in 1972, and an indication of the role ANU played at the forefront of Asian art research was the 1987 HRC theme, Europe and the Orient. Scholars from around the globe enjoyed a supportive environment at ANU, studying areas as diverse as the anthropology and literature of Bali, the influence of Eastern art on Western art in the late 19th century, and also things like the Chinese universe in Chinese art. In 1994, the HRC published a collection of art-related papers under the same heading, which had emerged following the 1987 focus theme. And reviewing that, the chapters still read well as both informative and formative positions on this developing field. The publication also introduces the East-West interface, a phrase at the time that warranted inverted commas. Now, while multidisciplinary approaches were embraced by ANU, the university's growth areas really did not support true cross-discipline research, particularly within the faculties, and this was a real problem. During the 1980s and early 1990s, ANU had 4 key areas that were dealing with Asia-related studies. There was the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies, the Faculty of Asian Studies, the HRC, the Faculty of Humanities, and within the Faculty of Humanities we had Asian research was being undertaken in history, anthropology, art history, anthropology, archaeology, as well as in the Cross-Cultural Research Centre. Now, for all of you who are involved or know anything about universities, we make all these nice little centres and units and so on, and sometimes they're put together in a way that absolutely inhibits cross sort of interaction. And certainly at this time in ANU's history, and I know some of us in the room have discussed this, we're well aware that that interaction between the research centres and the faculties in particular was almost non-existent. We can go back and reflect on the politics of all of that, but yes, we had all this great stuff happening over there, we had all this interesting stuff happening over here, and not a lot of it came together. We also found, though, there was a long-standing, this long-standing connection that we had between Asian art history and Asian studies, effectively really sort of halted, certainly at the faculty level, when John Clark left in 1992. His departure caused a gap at a critical time, and ANU was not really able to capitalise on a rapidly rising profile in Asian art history. Now, I say that knowing that full well there were pockets where things were really happening. Carolyn Turner's presence at the HRC as Deputy Director and periods as Director, along with her research profile and her scholars, some of you are here today, I've seen Christine and Michelle, there was really good stuff happening. The trouble is it was often happening, as I said, in a very disparate way. So by the time we had nearly 3 years where there was no Asian art history being courses taught at the faculty level. And during that time, as things happened, programs were rewritten and Asian art and culture was almost forgotten in terms of student options for students due to the dearth of staff expertise. In 1995, a new program of Asian art history was introduced to ANU when Robin Maxwell was appointed lecturer in Asian art history and curatorial studies. Maxwell had made herself known internationally through the publication Textiles of Southeast Asia, which is the first comprehensive study of Southeast Asian textiles, which placed them in both an artistic and cultural framework. And her approach was one that included aesthetic assessment, intercultural and regional differences and commonalities, along with nuanced interpretation of the meaning, purpose and use of these objects within community contexts. And this outlook was very well suited to the multidisciplinary outlook that was absolutely permeated ANU at the time. But after this sort of 3-year hiatus, it was quite hard to really re-establish some traction with Asian art. Maxwell put 3 courses in place, Asian Art and Architecture, one on Southeast Asian art, and Fabric of Life, a textile history course which focused on her own research expertise. As Maxwell was also responsible for the curatorial subjects based on her experience at the National Gallery of Australia, we really only had the Asian art courses run biannually. Interest in Asian art courses was steady, though to be frank, the rigidity of the degree programs meant that a number of students had to complete Asian art courses to reach their quota of art history subjects rather than having a genuine curiosity in this field. And I can say that from personal experience. I was one of the few, some of the people that were very genuinely interested at this time, as I said, were some of the other people in this room. Now, placing Asian art courses within the art history department of the Faculty of Humanities meant students received, as I said, little benefit from having such a range of Asian study research being undertaken within the ANU community. While there was some cross-listing of courses, basically the degree structures meant there was little opportunity or little leeway for students to engage broadly with Asian studies. But also putting us in the art history department also was done with a distinct philosophical premise. And Maxwell was really being a pioneer in ordering our perceptions towards Southeast Asian art, which was more often than not, of course, at that time classified more as ethnography rather than actually art history. So while the 1990s was an age of interdisciplinary approaches, for undergraduate students, these barriers to collaboration were almost insurmountable. Over the next decade, Maxwell had dual roles as a senior curator in Asian art and as a senior lecturer at ANU, and her part-time role meant less courses were taught, but there was a strong continuity for Asian art, and we also benefited greatly from this connection with the National Gallery and its collections. As I mentioned, Asian art also strengthened at ANU through Carolyn Turner's appointment at the HRC, and her credentials, of course, in contemporary Asian art had been firmly established through the Asia-Pacific Triennial, which she co-founded. When Maxwell moved to the NGA full-time in 2007, I was employed at ANU actually to teach the curatorial studies program, and my colleague Wei Fen Chia, who'd completed her PhD at ANU in Asian art history, was actually looking after the Asian art history courses. She reinvigorated the Asian art program and in 2009 introduced an undergraduate first-year course, which for the first time. And Chia really had visions for a dedicated Asian art history program. In 2001, she resigned and I moved into a full-time role doing both curatorial and Asian art history courses. By this time, the Faculty of Humanities was a part of the College of Arts and Social Sciences. The Faculty of Asian Studies and the Research School of Asia Pacific were together in the College of Asia Pacific. So there's been quite a lot of restructuring as well. Fortunately, Asian art history was seen as a strength for the university, just as Asian studies were. And in 2012, I was able to establish an undergraduate major and minor in Asian art history, a first for an Australian university. This brought together courses that were on offer across the university, because there were lots of people doing interesting stuff, but it was always, as I said, quite fragmented. But there was the cross-listing of courses from the different colleges was also seen by the powers that be as a very positive thing, and so there was really good active support for these arrangements. However, it quickly became apparent that many relevant course offerings were only available due to personal interests of staff. And with academic staff departing and not being replaced, it proved unviable to continue with the major in Asian art history. And this has only been a fairly recent decision. And this has been interesting in itself, as it speaks loudly of how culture is currently thought of in some disciplinary areas. The minor remains as a course of study and continues to draw on expertise from across ANU. The next part of ANU's Asian art history program has been the repositioning of art history. And from the beginning of 2014, art history was relocated to the School of Art and merged with the art theory department to form a new centre of art history and art theory. Bringing together two areas that had distinct approaches to visual culture has offered opportunities to rethink both. A new first-year curriculum has been developed that compares and contrasts methodological approaches to art history in a global context. The classical in Asian and Western art is just one such sort of topic example. East-West Interactions is a new honours and a graduate course that embraces cross-cultural methodologies, and we co-teach this with our colleagues. And also bringing Asian art history into this administrative centre at the School of Art has formalised many existing connections, particularly with my colleague Chaitanya Sambrani, whose courses on modernism in Asian art and contemporary Asian art are key elements of our Asian art history program. It also draws on much of the expertise the School of Art has with its long-time connections, particularly dealing with working with artists across Southeast Asia. In addition, the restructuring coincides with a university-wide change in course programs, which offers students easy access to courses outside of their disciplinary areas. And with many barriers to course entry removed, students studying Asian art history may enrol in a class and have little, or students enrolling may have little cognate background. So this brings me back to my recent experiences in Myanmar. And working on the course program, I reflected on my own experiences researching Myanmar art history since 1998. It was a formative process, and I really reflected on great change. I'm perhaps the first part of a first generation of Asian art historians who trained as Asian art historians. From a Southeast Asian art perspective, I definitely am. I'm researching in a country that is under-researched, effectively being closed to scholarly access from the 1950s to the 1990s. I'm doing primary empirical and iconographic research, an approach that is out of favour and that with little credit is gained for preparing detailed inventories of materials for the first time. I'm studying historical and contemporary materials spanning 2 millennia, a time period that would have me lack credibility in most disciplines. I study material in all mediums and secular and non-secular art. And given the historical cross-cultural exchanges that are part of Southeast Asia's history, my research focus must include a broad-ranging generalist approach, yet the expert generalist fails to pass the rigours in many academic areas. In Southeast Asia, however, we must start from a different premise. Notions of time, place and space defy Western ideas of the same, and even the term art is problematic as its meaning is not shared across cultures. Perhaps Southeast Asian art history should be discarded as a term and Southeast Asian visual culture substituted instead. This is more true to what the art and artefacts represent and engages in a much more pluralistic outlook. While this addresses part of the problem, the bigger one is simply that the discipline is still in its infancy. Its development is at odds with traditional academic disciplines and as it must start from a foundation of being multidisciplinary. And this can be a risky approach within a university setting when discipline specificity is often a strategic necessity. However, not acknowledging that Southeast Asian art history has its own set of foundational parameters will only slow its development and have it almost fighting against itself. So one day, and I'm sure it will happen, if we follow perhaps down along this path, I am an art historian will no longer need explanation. Thank you.